Do you think inflation is a political liability?
That's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid son of a... The only thing, my being the oldest president, I know more world leaders than any one of you ever met in your whole goddamn life.
Oh, a few classy examples there of President Biden going off on reporters. And as we count down the final days of his presidency, we're learning that Biden most likely will not hold an end-of-term news conference, which is traditional, but he will deliver a foreign policy speech tomorrow and then a farewell address on Wednesday. Speeches are one thing, but questions are important for our leaders. You wonder, is the president afraid to answer for some of these controversial decisions that he's made recently? For instance, you can go down the list, pardoning his son. He said he wouldn't. Transferring 11 Gitmo terrorist detainees to Oman for resettlement. See how that goes. Commuting sentences of dozens of death row prisoners, among others. Let's hear what the daughter on that last point of a murder victim had to say when Biden decided to take her mother's killer off of death row.
It's very frustrating that President Biden can have this power. You know, he wasn't charged for his own mishandling of classified documents because he was too old, and they said his memory was failing. He only proved that he's not capable of making presidential decisions.
Well, the president has reportedly also been convinced by, of all people, Al Sharpton to issue more pardons coming up.
I recently spoke to Reverend Al Sharpton, and he said that he would like the president to issue a pardon for Baltimore County State Attorney Marilyn Mosby and Jesse Jackson Jr. Can we expect to hear an announcement on any high-profile pardons such as these?
Yeah, I'm not going to get ahead of the president. He's going to make some more announcements or pardons and commutations. The president and his team is working through it. They're trying to figure out the best way forward.
Well, that certainly inspires confidence, given what they've done so far. And I think the translation there from KJP is, yes, there are more pardons coming, maybe part of that sort of laundry list from Al Sharpton. I want to start, Anita, with you on this question about the possibility, maybe the likelihood, that Biden is not going to do a term-ending press conference. He has avoided questions in an unprecedented way throughout his term. Just from a journalistic standpoint, isn't it important for the leader of the free world to answer in a formal setting questions as he exits the stage?
Yeah, of course it is. And in a White House briefing, KJP was very ambiguous about whether he would do that. I'm guessing that he's not going to. President Biden holds the record for the fewest number of press conferences of the last 7 presidents. I think when you weigh the risk reward, the White House team looks at that and thinks, there's too much risk there. Look at the things you listed at the top. The commutations, the pardoning of his son, a number of other things. If he's asked about that, I think he's going to have trouble answering. He mixes up dates, names, events, too much risk.
So, Jason, how much of this do you think is his team, because it's all about his team, right? He doesn't seem to be making too many decisions himself, saying we don't want to have these questions asked of us because it could get uncomfortable, or the team saying we know he's not really up for answering questions?
Well, to your point and to Anita's, I don't think President Biden is capable of actually answering the questions. He's always had to use a cheat sheet. I don't think he has the cognitive capability, and I think they are going to continue to try to gaslight and rewrite history. You can't do that when a reporter from, say, the Wall Street Journal is asking you a tough question. So I don't think it's going to, I understand why it's not going to happen. I think it's fundamentally wrong.
Jackie, it seems like the verdict, at least the initial verdict on the Biden presidency, is very much in from the American people. We saw it in the election results, of course. And then here's a new poll from the Associated Press. How will Biden's presidency be remembered? That's the question. And 25% of Americans total said it will be remembered as good or great. I would love to meet those people. And then a majority saying poor or terrible, a sizable plurality saying terrible.
You did exactly what I did with that poll. I did the math on it. So it's 53% poor or terrible. That is the majority and how they feel. To the 25% that said great or good, the rest said 28%. They said it was average. These are the worst approval ratings that we've seen for a president. They are worse than Donald Trump's first term after he exited, and there were a number of people who, had issues with him at that time, or Barack Obama's second term. To your point, Anita, this is not a president that communicated with the American people. He had major foreign policy disasters that, we'll be dealing with the consequences for years to come. And economy. I mean, I'm a business person. We talk about that every day between inflation and the overall economy, and I'm not talking about the stock market. People really suffered, so I'm not surprised to see numbers like this.
We are looking backward, of course, at Biden, but the real story coming up is the future looking forward. And to that point, all eyes on Capitol Hill this coming week. 13 of Donald Trump's cabinet nominees will face the Senate in high-stakes confirmation hearings. Trump and his party hoping it'll be a quick and easy process, but it may not quite play out that way.
We have very urgent crises that have to be dealt with. President Trump needs his cabinet in place right now. Every one of these cabinet nominees needs to get a fair hearing. My greatest concern is that the Democrats don't use procedural opportunities to slow us down.
Republicans choosing to rush nominees is quickly becoming a pattern. It's hard not to wonder, what are the Republicans trying to hide about these nominees from the American people?
President Trump's going to go in on day number 1 and sign 100 executive orders. But those orders go nowhere unless we get these nominees across the finish line.
As you heard just there, Trump is reportedly planning to issue those 100 executive orders on perhaps even his very first day in office. Jason, you've spent a lot of time on the Hill. Of course, you were a powerful person up there for a while. As you look over to the other side of Capitol Hill and the Senate and some of these confirmation hearings that are due next week, what are you looking for? What stands out to you? Because it seems like the Dems, based on what we heard there from Schumer, they're looking to maybe try to claim a scalp or two here.
Look, Majority Leader Thune is doing the right thing. They're going to quickly do those confirmation hearings. Democrats can ask their questions along the way, but it's up to Senator Schumer as the minority. They have some rights. Are they going to slow it down and impede the ability of the president to put his cabinet in place? That would be a shame. It would be wrong. I think America will get mad at the Democrats very quickly. They get to have a say, but they can't just drag this out. But I think Schumer is already foreshadowing that that's what he's going to do. You know,
Jackie, we've heard an argument from Trump supporters and from the incoming administration saying, especially in light of that terrorist attack on New Year's Day, you need a national security team in place immediately. That doesn't preclude, I think, scrutiny and tough, fair questions. That's important for any party or any new administration. But there is that sense of urgency that we're hearing from Team Trump saying, let's not dilly-dally.
Absolutely. I mean, he's effectively been the president for the since November 5th, since the election, because President Biden is in his lame duck period, but also really not capable of managing the country. And so we've seen disaster after disaster during this period. National security, when you talk about what happened in New Orleans, but also what's happening with the wildfires now, too. He's got major messes that he needs to clean up. He's got to put a budget together. He needs his cabinet in place to be able to do that. He needs Congress to work with him so that he can work on the border, so that he can work on tax reform for the American people. The issues I brought up on a business basis that people suffered with, they want to see those corrected. Part of that is what they voted on, but also on security and everything else. He needs to get to work.
You know, Anita, before the show, you and I were chatting in the green room, and you were talking about this sort of flurry of executive actions from Biden at the tail end of his presidency, and then basically the retaliation from Trump, which he's been promising to do. And you had a thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the Biden administration wants him to go out in a blaze of glory with these flurry of executive orders, and Donald Trump will come in and try to reverse them. I don't think that's what the American people want. Look at what's happening in the world. Wars all over the world. California is burning down. I think people, they want a peaceful transfer of power, and they want to move forward.
Yeah, we've got a blaze, but not glory, it would seem right now.
I'm Steve Ducey. I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.